Good day, and welcome to Nano Answers Weekly Wraps. As usual, we'll do start with some macro stories and then end with a tech/AI segment at the end. Like the last couple of weeks, unfortunately, we're going to have to do another election special this week with the focus on France and the UK, because those are developing stories that have huge implications, not just on their particular countries, but also on international markets as well. And then in our AI/tech segment, we'll talk about NVIDIA as well as Ilya new company. So starting off with the elections in the UK. When I did the start of the year, predictions for the year, I did mention that there will be an election in the UK this year, and I said it was boring. It wasn't even worth talking about. I mentioned more about what is happening with regards to the SA elections and the US elections, etc. But I said at that point in time that the UK elections were going to be quite boring. We knew the winner was going to be, we knew what the loser was going to be. It was pretty much a done deal. And the winner was going to be the Labour Party, and the loser was going to be the Conservative Party, and that was going to be just the outcome. We didn't know exactly the date, because the way it works in the UK and France, etc., and even South Africa to a certain extent, you have certain ranges in terms of what date you can put your election on. And they had like the end of the year or something they could have done it through. And the fact that they called it early, wasn't a big deal. So yeah, that was the expectations. However, in the last couple of weeks, a couple of things have changed. Firstly, I mentioned Nigel Farage. Now, Nigel Farage, for those that don't know, is kind of like a Donald Trump kind of figure in the UK. He's not even a prime minister, but he is the guy that pretty much drove Brexit. It was the thing called the UK Independent Party. The way the UK system works, it's important to understand, is that, like in South Africa, so you have, for instance, MK, you have the EFF, you have the DA, you have the ANC, they each get like a certain percentage of votes, and those percentage of votes translate directly into parliament seats. In the UK, it's not like that. You've got to basically go for each individual seat. So you could have a situation where somebody has 51 or percent of the seats, the other guy has 49% of the 51% of the votes, the other person has 49% of the votes. But the person 51 basically wins every single seat by 51%, and then the other party has no seats in parliament, even though they have 49% of the votes for the country. That's called the first past the post thing, okay? And so in the UK, that's the system they have. So they have a first past the post. So unless you have a majority in each individual seat, you do not win the seat. You can have, 20, 30% of the total vote of the country and have no seats in parliament. That is the case. Or you could have basically, less than 10% of the seats and have, a substantial number of seats in the parliament. So you can have a party with 2-3 times as much votes total for the country, having no seats or even far fewer seats than a party that has, 10% or 5% of the votes for the country, just because it's where those votes are and not basically the overall votes of the country that matter. And in the UK, Nigel Farage basically has a couple of times gotten quite a number of votes. He's gotten in excess of 10% of the votes of the country. And yet he's basically struggled to get even 1 or 2 seats for his party, because the votes are widely spread across the country, and therefore it's very difficult for him to get any particular seat. The Scottish National Party is a party that gets seats in Parliament in the UK that has far fewer votes than Nigel Farage's parties. Yet, like I said, because they are concentrated in Scotland and in each of those individual districts, they're basically able to go and win the majority. They get those seats in Parliament. Now, getting back to the election here. It turns out that Nigel Farage, who just a few weeks ago was saying he was not going to be running in this election, has decided to join the Reform Party as the leader. And Reform is now basically polling, according to some polls, either equal to or ahead of the Tories, the current government. The UK has effectively been a two-party system for quite some time. Occasionally you do have a third party having to come into play to basically, top up, the votes to get a majority, but effectively there's two main parties. Like Republicans and Democrats in the US, there's the Tories and the Labour Party. There's usually been a Tory Prime Minister or a Labour Prime Minister in the UK. Now we're seeing a case where Reform, which is the starter party, is now getting more votes overall than the Tories. They will not have more seats overall because, like I said, they have to be concentrated in certain, districts, certain, areas to get the seat for that area. But they basically overall in the entire country will get probably equal to, or if not going to match the Tories or beat them, it's almost what they get overall. That's probably going to translate to 3 to 5 seats in total for the Tories, for Reform, versus like 100. If the Tories do really badly, they might get 60 or 70 seats. If they do as we kind of predict right now, they'll get like 100 seats. But Reform is going to have more votes in overall than the Tories are going to have. Or there's at least a very good chance of that happening. And what does this mean? This could be a seismic shift in how the UK government works going forward. It would be one of the biggest moves in the UK situation for a long time. And understand, Reform is a very, very unorthodox, unheterodox party. It's not like the Tories and Labour, which are the Conservatives and Liberals in the UK, are quite similar. Reform is a very different kind of party. So yeah, this is something interesting to watch out. It may not affect this particular election too much. Like I said, in all likelihood, as best as Reform could do, it's like 5, maybe 6 seats, but probably 5 seats at maximum. Probably they're only going to get about 3 if they're lucky. That might just not even happen. There's still a chance they might even get that 3. But they are probably going to get in excess of 20% of the vote. They are going to be either the third or the second largest party in terms of total votes. And the thing with a situation like this here is that when you have so many votes, but you're just not hitting the seats as yet, the barrier between you getting like no seats and getting a hell of a lot of seats is not that far apart. It's 1 or 2%, maybe 5%, and you could be seeing them getting a significant number of seats. If they are able to kind of replace the Tories in the minds of Conservatives as the party for them, like kind of Donald Trump has kind of replaced Republicans overall as the figurehead for the Conservatives, you could easily see in the next 5 years' time, or 5 years' time, that the next opposition, parliament, official opposition parliament in the UK government will be led by Nigel Farage, which is a very unusual thing. If you told somebody like 5 years ago that this was going to happen, or 10 years ago this was going to happen, they would not have believed you. Okay. Next to the French election. If you took the UK election was bad, the French election is worse. Okay, this is what happened in France. They had the EU election. So France has an election for France, and France has also an election towards the EU, because the EU is almost like an overarching government. Okay, you can imagine France is a province. It's not a province, it's a country, but imagine it's a province in the country of the EU, European Union. And therefore you have the local elections, you also have the national elections, or the international elections in this case. And in the last EU election, Emmanuel Macron, his party, did very badly, and therefore what we have seen is he's called an early election. Okay, how early? Well, this is a couple things that you've got to keep in mind. You've got to be registered to vote in France. He's called the election so quickly that there's no chance for anyone new to register. If you have not registered for the EU election that just happened, you do not have a chance to vote in this election in France. So he's basically, you can't get new voters and you can't go and get like a vote raising kind of campaign out there, getting young voters in or whatever. If you've not registered for the EU election, you can't vote in the French election because there's not enough time to register. That's how quick it is, okay? He also basically, this obviously had to be part of his plan, because, I mean, he called the election this early, so he knew that this was going to be the thing he did. That was going to be the outcome, that he couldn't get new voters. So, kind of weird to understand that you just lost an election, okay? So you had an election that you just lost, and then you want to call a new election, and you have purposely created a situation where there are no new voters. The only people that can vote for this new election are the same people that did not vote for you for the last election. That's a weird thing to have done. So why would he have done that? Well, his idea may have been, and what likely was, that he was going to be the party of sensibility, because he was going to be the party of normality versus the boogeyman, which is the right-wing party, by a party run by Marine Le Pen. Okay, this party is kind of like the French version of Reform in the UK. Marine Le Pen has come out second a number of times in elections against Emmanuel Macron, and his strategy has usually been just get into the top two, and when people you have to choose between him and Marine Le Pen, they're going to basically choose him because she's considered to be too extreme. In the last, in the EU election, her party did the best, but they didn't get over 50% of the vote. So his idea was, okay, yeah, they got like 37% of the vote, but what I will do is I'll call a new election, the same voters, but now I'm giving them a choice between just me and her. Why just me and her? Because there won't be enough time for the other parties to organize themselves. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're going to basically, push as the number one candidate. So it's going to be basically between my party and her party as who's going to be the leader of the French Parliament, because this is a parliamentary election, not a presidential election. So a couple of things have gone wrong for him. Firstly, Marine Le Pen is not as toxic as she once was. And in fact, the party of Nicolas Sarkozy, they had talked about having an alliance with her. That's just one thing that went wrong. So firstly, his opponent, he's not as toxic as he was, so he's not going to be having that advantage he thought he would have. The second thing is that he's not the opponent. To the right, he thought he'd basically be able to consolidate everyone to the left of him and have them follow him to oppose Marine Le Pen to the right. Turned out the guys to the left of him said, no, we don't want you. We will form our own coalition on the left. So he has an opponent to the right and an opponent to the left. And so this idea that he's going to have the ability to create a situation where he's going to have a consolidation of all leftist parties and centrist parties against a right-wing party, and therefore, maintain that majority in parliament that he wants to have, etc., that's gone. And what does this mean? Well, it turns out the market actually would prefer the right-wing party to the left-wing party. Why? The right-wing party basically is not as extreme economically as the left-wing party is. The left-wing party wants to come out and do a couple of things. Things such as, for instance, impose a wealth tax, which has been tried in the past, and it caused a huge outflux of wealthy people from France. It wants to impose an exit tax to try and prevent that outflow of people. It wants to impose basically higher minimum wage, raising it by I think 15%. It wants to basically increase the wages significantly of government workers. And what you must understand is just how substantial the government sector in France is. It's one of the biggest government sectors in the world. So you're looking at a situation where the government sector in France is well in excess of 50% of the total GDP, as opposed to under 40% in the US, for instance. So we're talking about a very big government sector that's going to get higher paid workers, that's going to basically give things out, like, for instance, pension reform reversal. So it's going to lower the effective age of when you can retire, etc., etc. If this party gets into power, we are talking about hundreds of billions of euros of extra spending per year for France. Where's he going to get the money from? Unlikely. And that has resulted in a couple of things. We've seen the risk around French debt go up dramatically. It's a massive spike in the last few days for French debt. And why is this important for us globally as well? France is the second biggest economy in Europe. If the second biggest economy in Europe goes on this spending spree, breaking the Eurozone regulations around 3% debt, France currently has just under 6% annual deficits. They should have 3% as a max. That's what's the rules under the EU, the Eurozone. If France does that, that really changes what the Eurozone situation looks like, because if the second biggest guy is doing this, what reason does the Greeces of the world or the Portugals of the world have to maintain their current or their targets of 3%? Okay, Italy will probably follow. Italy's already spending more. We'll find all the small countries starting to spend a lot more, and that will really weaken the Euro's fiscal situation. So yeah, this is a really important election. It's going to happen in a couple of weeks' time. And I think that in terms of just what the outcome is going to be, we better hope it's either Macron's party or the right-wing party. If it's the left-wing party, we are going to be seeing a significant downturn in terms of not just the credit rating of the Eurozone, but also things, for instance, like probably the euro versus the dollar, etc. Okay. Moving on to AI, a couple of things. Firstly, the AI company, NVIDIA, which is currently the darling of the markets, is now the largest company in the world. They've overtaken Apple and Microsoft to become the number one company in the world. If you look at, for instance, their P ratios, you look at their revenue versus share price, these are all well outside the norm. The market's pricing in a lot into NVIDIA. We still have it in an AI portfolio, because if AI does turn out to be real, if AI does turn out to be the thing that people are all believing it's going to be, some of these valuations are not crazy. We've seen Nvidia basically rally over the last, say, 2-3 years on an unbelievable scale. What Naspers did over 2 decades, they've done it in 3 or 4 years. But they've not missed any targets as yet. And it does seem to be that spending on AI chips, which Nvidia seems to have a little monopoly in, continues the pace. And the next thing I want to talk about is Ilya. He's the guy that is considered to be the brains behind OpenAI. Sam Altman runs it. Ilya was the guy behind the technology. He recently left OpenAI. He's starting a new AI company. This AI company is going to be focused on safe super intelligence. They're going to have one focus, creating super intelligence. So we have the guy that's probably the most knowledgeable about AI, leaving the top AI company to start his own AI company with a focus of getting as quickly as possible to super intelligence, artificial super intelligence. Those that don't know, AI, AGI, artificial general intelligence, is getting like brain power like the smartest like people. Artificial super intelligence is getting brain power smarter than the smartest person. In fact, by some definitions, smarter than every human being in the world combined. The number one scientist in AI in the world is basically betting that that's going to happen really soon. So if you do believe in the story around AI, that's the kind of story you want to believe in order to justify the valuations we need with companies like Nvidia at the moment. Okay, that's it for me this week. Thanks for joining me. And hopefully next week we discuss things. There'll be less elections and more normal market stories. Cheers.